everybody. Welcome back. Next up, we have Tobias Heussner. Was I close?
That was close enough, yeah.
Tobias is a long-standing industry veteran. He's executive producer over at CI Games, and he's going to be walking through different production management strategies. So with that, it's all yours, Tobias.
Thanks, Jay. So welcome, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Like, it's kind of like strange for me talking because usually I like to interact with all of you. So I hope you have a great time at ECGC. And welcome to Agile, Waterfall, and the trip to the moon. So we'll see what this has all to do. So basically, Jay already gave you some intro here, who I am. So I'm currently the executive producer of CI Games Warsaw, where I oversee the local franchise, basically the entire Sniper Ghost Warrior series. I've been in the game industry for over 20 years now. I've worked as a game designer, I worked as a producer, I worked as a designer again, and then back as a producer. So I jumped back and forth between those two roles. During this time, I had the pleasure to work on titles such as Drakensang Online and the entire Drakensang series. I've been involved in games like Pet Wet that are probably more famously known as the horse games, as Will Wrights once mentioned them. Also did NBA 2K Playgrounds, and as mentioned recently, jumping on the Sniper Ghost Warrior series. Besides this, I'm also the current chair of the executive board from the IGDA Special Interest Group Game Writing, and as such, and along with my interest in game narrative, I published 2 books that some of you probably know, some not, on game narrative and how to design game narrative, specifically some advanced topics, and how you basically can tell better stories. So, short disclaimer before we start into the session. There's no one on this earth who does not make mistakes, so please forgive if some of the information might be not 100% correct in this session. I'm not fault-free, so also due to the nature of this presentation, some stuff will stay a little bit on a higher level. So there might be the possibility of misunderstandings and things like this. But yeah, just keep in mind, no one is perfect. And if you find anyone who is perfect, let me know. Probably we have a job for him. Also, every studio culture is different. And that's something we need to keep in mind, especially as we talk now about project management and how to manage our projects, because this difference is very important, as we will see throughout this presentation and also later on, and how it affects us. First, what we will not talk about. In this session specifically, we will not talk about one specific approach that fits everyone. Just by the way, as I said, like, if you find one of those solutions, let me know. I haven't found them. We will also not do a deep dive into one specific method. So some of the information here will stay on a more shallow level, as mentioned before, because we simply do not have the time to dig deeper. Project management is a fairly complex topic. It's an ever-evolving topic. So so I hope I don't do anyone injustice by not going too deep into each of those methods. And as mentioned, there is no silver bullet. And if you find them, please share it with me. If you find it, please share it with me. But what will we talk about? We will talk in this session about different project management approaches. We will analyze their merits and their flaws to see and to get a better informed understanding what they can give us, where they're useful, and where not. We also will discuss how culture ultimately will affect our choice of the project management approach. Last time I counted, there have been around 8,500 different approaches to project management. So I hope every one of you brought a lot of time, because there's a bit stuff that we need to discuss. And once we covered those, we also have a smaller, more or less significant or not insignificant number of house rules for those who are familiar with role-playing games. So let's get started. first method here in the room is it's the so-called Waterfall methodology, and I think most of you have heard about it. It's kind of like the grandfather of project management approaches. It's been around like basically ever since the beginning. In the Waterfall method, everything follows a clear sequential order. Everything is ordered. You know at any possible moment in time exactly where you are. So super structured, easy to read. And if you are wondering why the games industry has milestones and all those deliverables, well, because we at some point had something like a waterfall approach to our planning. As you probably are aware of, this is not as easy to have this order as it sounds on the first place. Yes, it sounds great to have everything figured out first, then implement it, then test it, and then, well, we ship it and maintain it, maybe have a patch or not. In the Waterfall methodology, knowledge is the key. And that's a big problem too, as we will see when we look at the pros and cons. Basically, to have a sequential order, we need to know the elements of this order. So it's hard to implement something that was not designed first. It's hard to design anything that we don't know that we need. On the good side is, as said before, we can easily track it. We can communicate it. If someone gives you a call or asks you on an elevator, hey, where is my project? Where's my game? Oh, we are in the implementation phase and we are 2 weeks away from shipping. Well, then they probably say like, oh, wait, you're 2 weeks away from shipping and you're in implementation. You may want to add some more QA here for the verification of your project. But essentially, you can very easily communicate where you are. And everyone knows where you are based on this model. This leads us a little bit to the pros. This is a very predictable approach to project management. You can basically, once you have the knowledge, this is something we will get to, you can basically predict when you will be able to ship it. You can predict when a certain element will be ready. You know with a very high degree of certainty what it will cost you to do something. That makes it very cost efficient because you can plan around the cost. If you know that you need 6 months to deliver something, well, then you know exactly more or less on your average cost per man or woman in the team. You know, okay, if I have 10 people for 6 months, that's the amount that this project will cost me. So you can be very efficient and optimizing around those costs. There's a clear task relationship. Now, this is interesting here. Think of the waterfall in this case, not just like in those 5 stages that you see up there. This is something you can also see for your art team. You start with a concept. Then a 3D modeler takes the concept, makes the 3D model. Then a texture artist applies the texture. Then if it is a character, the rigger applies the rig and the skinning, and so on and so forth. So you can have a very clear relationship of steps that you can define. And as you have this relationship, you can always know exactly where which element is. And due to this clear knowledge requirement, you usually have a strong documentation. Again, we're looking here a bit in the history of the games industry. Most of you have probably heard about this famous document, the game design document. Well, that's the origin of it. It is part of this process of designing and defining all requirements at the beginning. But what are the disadvantages? This is a highly inflexible approach. And now comes like saying like, wait, isn't the game industry like a kind of like creative industry? Yes, it is. And that's the problem that the industry, ever since the beginning, has with this approach. We want to be creative. We want to react. We may need to do design changes. As long as our game is small enough, we can probably predict a lot of those issues and design ahead. But once we are talking about bigger games, and we're talking games in the scale of like AA titles, AAA for sure, but AA titles already, you will see like a complexity that says like, I don't know if the feature that I sort of makes is fun. I don't know all the elements. So this approach gets like a bit, hard to follow, because you cannot follow and tell everyone what is needed. And that's the problem here. You need a lot of knowledge up front of your project, knowledge that you don't have. So it's kind of like trying to looking into this crystal ball. Okay, this will be my game, and this is all the features that I will have, and this is exactly how all those features work. And now please, programmers, do it exactly how I predicted it. Otherwise, everything will fall apart. And it does fall apart. That's a guarantee. Looking at the other end of the spectrum. So Waterfall, the traditional one. A few years back, I would have said, like, when we talk about Agile, well, Agile is the new kid in the block, the new thing around. Now I would have almost to say, like, no, it is not that new any longer. And a lot of studios tried the Agile approach already. Agile approach in itself is a very iterative, cyclic model. Basically, the idea is we start with what we know, we develop what we know, go through all the phases, and start again. And at some point, we will leave the cycle because we are good enough. To define what good enough is, we just simply include everyone we can in the team, or most of the people in the team. So we talk a lot, we collaborate a lot, because the more knowledge we can bring on the table in each cycle, well, the more we know about what we are doing, and the more we can probably, at least in the small cycle, predict what we are doing. The focus of the Agile method is highly, as you probably heard, and before you ask, we will talk also about some of the sub approaches to this model, but the focus of Agile was always on teamwork. So instead of having this requirement that we need to know everything up front, we work as a team. We develop our knowledge as a team, and we live with the fact that there's a lot of things that we don't know, but that we need to work out and find out. That makes this approach extremely flexible, because you can react. You just basically accept, okay, I don't know everything. Let's find out step by step what I need to find out and develop and get to the point. And well, eventually at some point we'll get ready. It's a low knowledge requirement. You don't need to know much. You need to know basically to start with the Agile method, not much more than I want to make a game. I have maybe this character. Maybe you want to think about a camera perspective to make the character visible, but you don't really need a lot to start with. Agile really focuses on this creative thinking pattern. So it's very close to our industry. That's what made it so attractive in the first place. Like, that's why a lot of game developers, even today, would say, like, how do you work? We do an Agile approach. We are highly inclusive. We want to have every voice matters. And in the end, we want to be super creative, polishing, iterating, like, until we find the right game. From a creative standpoint, that's great. From a business standpoint, it's not, because it's unpredictable. And that's where a lot of the producers will probably get crazy. Like, on the one hand, you need to tell your investors for your game, whoever it is, even if you develop your indie game, and you need to tell your family members or friends who sponsor you, hey, when do we have the game and I get my money back? Well, when I'm done. Try this with your bank. Your bank will not say when I'm done is good enough. Unless you have the reputation that you can deliver, they will say, like, yeah, come back when you are done, and then we give you the money. It's an extremely expensive approach, Agile. And that's the ugly truth of this approach. Why is it expensive? Because you don't know how long you stay in those cycles. If you're lucky, if you're very disciplined, you can make this work. But if you are not disciplined and you go to a lot of cycles, and especially like with my examples at the beginning, you start your project basically with the knowledge, okay, I want to make a game, want to have a character runs around. Well, I probably could ask the audience how many games they can think of this kind of like rough description fits in. It's a lot. So you're very, very far away from actually having a final shippable product. So, and the further you're away from a shippable product, the more time you need to invest, the more expensive the product becomes. Because one of the most, or one of the cost drivers in the games industry is the headcount, is the amount of people over in a certain amount of time that you need to invest. This approach also requires a lot of discipline. As you are, let me explain why. Because as you are in this iterative process, in this agile process, you will find out that there is a game, that you will probably come to your vision, you find your game, you develop your game. But on the other hand, you're also most of the time working with creative people. And as a producer, you probably also are creative to a certain extent. And if you say like, okay, I go through those cycles over a period of 2, 3, 4 years, you can probably imagine that you will get a lot of new ideas. Ideas that say like, this makes my game better. And it may be true that those ideas make your game better, but they do not bring you closer to a shippable project or to a shippable product. But only the shippable product gets you your money back. So if you're not disciplined and cut a lot of your good ideas, you will get lost. Also, in the Agile approach, a lot of people tend to not document their findings. If you under-document your product, you become vulnerable. Why? Because if you lose a team member, you lose knowledge of your product. So there's all this discipline again. You need to still document at least enough so that you can bring other people's in, that you can work with the document, with the different disciplines, that you can work with, in case some knowledge is not available, that you do not lose this knowledge on a long time. As promised, not as long as I talked now about Agile in general, talking quickly about Scrum. Why Scrum separate? Because Scrum is defined. It's a very defined sub-part of the Agile approach. And I saw a lot of people usually kind of like say like, okay, I'm doing Agile and actually do Scrum and I do this somehow. No, Scrum itself is very well defined to a certain extent, as we can see here. So it is focused on fast iterations. That means one of those cycles is really defined as it takes 2 weeks or a maximum of 4 weeks. It always ends essentially in each of those sprints with a potentially shippable product, which is also the challenge for games, because normally within 2 to 4 weeks, you don't have anything shippable, at least if you have a bigger scale of your project. So that's why you need to be careful how you plan your sprints. It's not, by the way, if I'm mentioning all those methods, I don't want to say bias to any method here, as we will see later. Just like this is things to keep in mind. Again, it is an Agile method. As such, it's very flexible. It is very inclusive because especially Scrum is based on the idea we work as a team. We have a few roles in those teams, but we work as a team and every voice matters. Everyone is included in the decision process. It is also structured. We do have the structure. We do know where's our backlog. We do know what to do in this sprint. We do know how long the sprint is, and we do know what is expected at the end of the sprint. And every day we're following up on this. So we have a very good structure. This is actually eliminating some of those discipline issues that we saw in the raw Agile approach. It's also result driven. As I said, like the goal of Scrum is to always end with a shippable product. Again, in games development, we not necessarily have this. So we need to define what do we think is a shippable product? What is the result of a sprint every time that we finish a sprint without extending the sprint length. Once again, it's an Agile method. As such, it requires discipline. It also has a problem with the size of the teams. If you try to do Scrum with a 100-man and stronger team, it gets very problematic. Obviously, Scrum by definition does not have Scrum teams of the size of 100. I think the maximum that they recommend is around 10, 12 people in a Scrum team. So you start having the Scrum of Scrums. So you see there's like a kind of like complexity coming in. Again, it is an agile method as such, potentially being expensive by how long you spend in those sprints, unless you have well-defined markers. It is unpredictable if you use it as a raw method, because again, you can basically define what your shippable product is at each stage, and then you only know what it will be after the next 1 or 2 sprints, but you never know how long it takes you to the really final product. So this is like coming all together with the Scrum. So it does eliminate some of the problems that we saw with the Agile method. When the Agile method is raw, it's a good method, Scrum itself, but it does have not just advantages. Kanban is another one. And I mention it here separately because usually Kanban and Scrum and Agile, they are all kind of like used together in kind of like a fashion homebrew way. Kanban itself is a method that is based on the idea, okay, I can basically put my task on a whiteboard, blackboard, corkboard, whatever, and I can move cards and I can clearly see where each task is. It has a strong focus on how much work can each individual get done in a certain amount of time. So usually there are some rules that you apply, like everyone can only have 1 or 2 or 3 tasks in progress at any given moment. And if there's too much to do for one person in a given amount of time, you know this person is basically will burn out and cannot fulfill their tasks. The process stages are defined. That's something that makes it very easy to read. We do not, but we clearly see, okay, this task is currently in this stage. So that makes it easy for follow-up tasks to see, okay, the 3D artist is just finishing the 3D model. I'm the texture artist, so this is probably my next task coming up next week. So that makes it pretty nice. Seeing this reveals bottlenecks in your pipelines, which is nice too, because you know, okay, all my animators have way too many tasks, so probably I should add another animator to the team. It's easy to read. I mean, we can probably see this example picture and can relatively, even so this is not a game, relatively easy figuring out what each person is doing and probably even what their specialties are. It avoids crunch, because since we are basically doing a capacity planning, we know how much capacity we have to fulfill our goals in a given time, and we do see early, in a more analyzed way, where we run into these bottlenecks, where we need to add more people to avoid that a single person needs to work overtime to achieve their goals. The defined stages, again, nice to read, clear to communicate. Problems, again, unpredictable. Yes, we can put everything in the to-do list, but unless our team knows how the relationships work and is very disciplined about this, we don't know when they actually will finish anything in their Kanban board. Yes, again, we can mix it with other methods to say like, hey, finish your board within 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and can bet on it. But by its rawest form, it does not have any kind of like timing in this sense, other than work gets done, is estimated, and then we know at some point probably it should be done. Requires the discipline of the team to work together, to communicate their steps. If you have people who do not like to move their cards on the board, then you probably lose a lot of track and overview in your project. You do not really have the control, because in the raw Kanban method, basically everyone can grab whatever task is open, get it done, as long as they have capacity. And it is a approach that looks nice if you are working with a small team. But if you work with a 100-man team, try to set up a whiteboard with 100 people, and every person can have at least 3 to 4 tasks. So you talk about like 400 cards on this board. So yes, okay, you can have different boards, but then again, like with 100 people, even if you split this in 10 boards to have only 10 people per board, you still need someone like, okay, did my programmer realize that the artist on their artboard finished the task that he needed to implement his feature? You see, there's a lot of difficulties involved with it. If you work with a small team, then it works perfectly. If you work with a big team, that's one of the disadvantages that this method has. Now, the less known thing is the adaptive project framework. Basically here, we assume change will happen. The project is never stable. We don't know everything. We just plan what we know now, but we also plan that something will change. We anticipate the risks. So basically, by assuming where risks will, we plan for those risks. We allocate resources for risks, so we are well prepared. And then go into our cycle, plan, talk, communicate, trying to avoid the risks and adapt our way of working together basically every day, every week, based on the risks that we identified. So we say like, okay, today we want to do this, we do it. Tomorrow we talk about this. Or maybe not now in the next 2 days we can do this because our risks are less. But we always kind of like feel there are risks. It's a perfect fit for an ever-changing industry, which is the game industry. So it sounds like a good fit because there are risks, we anticipate the risks, we are prepared for the risks, so what can go wrong? We already planned with everything that we should know. We are collaborating, perfect for creatives. And I like to always say this, and this is a good place here. Great games are made by great teams. There is rarely an individual who makes a great game. Yes, I know there are some very great games done by a single developer, but those are basically the exceptions that prove the norm. So normally most games are done by a team of the developers, and this approach is really focusing on this team that evolves, that gets better with the process, that collaborates, and then adapts to their problems. And it's unpredictable because yes, we do try to say in the beginning that there is change, but we do not know what change. We do anticipate risks, but we don't know how much those risks cost us. So by this by basically this approach of risk management, we become resource heavy because suddenly we say like, okay, just because I think there might be a problem with the render pipeline down the road, I have a render engineer on the team, and then never ever there's any render issue. Well, but still I paid a render engineer on the team. So that makes it super expensive if I really try to keep all those potential risks in check and be prepared for them. And the bigger the project gets, the more complex those risks get. And again, here we see like the thing is like, who of us can actually predict all risks, anticipate all risks in a project with 50, 100, 200 people? There are also risks that are also not even related to the development itself. What if a key person gets sick? Do I just hire another person just in case someone eventually gets sick in a given month of a milestone? Risky. Going back a little bit to the traditional models now, the critical path method. You would see this actually as part of the waterfall model. Here, your project is defined by the critical path. The waterfall model by itself still defines like everything in your project plan as need to be done. The critical path model basically says like, no, not everything needs to be done. Only that is most critical to achieve your goal, and the critical path itself is the longest path to the goal. So like basically everything that is essential and its dependency needs to be done. And that defines your project length. Everything else, well, if we have time, we can do it. If we can't do it, then, well, it wasn't essential anyway. So we can just forget about this. Again, this is a more traditional model. So we see you first plan, and then you execute your plan. And while you execute your plan, you hope that you haven't forgotten anything 6 months or 12 months before you actually reach this stage. That's what you will see, like with the traditional models. They are very predictable. They come from a business world where everything should be predictable. So that's why they cater into this area. It's very easy to allocate resources in this model because I know exactly what is essential. I can exactly say, okay, at this point I need this people, this point this, and so on and so forth. Perfect for the allocation of resources. I exactly know when my critical parts are done, so I can set deadlines for those. I can say like, hey, I have this milestone and you get this features, and this is super essential for my game. But what is essential? Is this jumping mechanic that I just thought of in the beginning essential or not for my jump and run? Does my character need to swim, or was it less interesting? So there's the creative process, and that's the problem for the critical parts method. You don't know what is essential in a game. You may know some of the very core elements that are essential, but anything that is like basically making your game just like this much better, you would probably discard as not essential, but it is essential to reach a quality product. Again, it's an inflexible model because you plan ahead and then you're just supposed to execute. You're not supposed to add any step once you started executing your plan, because that would eventually change your critical path. So, and add uncertainty. Again, classical method, classical problem, you need a lot of knowledge. After all those methods, I'm talking like a little bit because it is coming up sometimes as like potentially like, why don't we look into other industry, what they do? There's one like that sticks always out, that is Six Sigma. But Six Sigma is by itself not a project management approach. It's a business approach. It's how do we do business? It basically asks like, how can we do better? And it aims to design processes in your company that basically guarantee that at some point you have 99.999 something success rate. So you basically eliminate all failures because your process is so good that whatever you throw at this process works. So it is exactly meant to reduce variation. It is meant to reduce bugs, variations, but it's a very static approach. And you will probably feel like this is something you can only do if you know exactly what you're doing and you have like a blueprint that you always fulfill. Then you can optimize your blueprint. Like if you have annual releases of your title, you can optimize your process around those annual releases. And you can basically polish all the edges to be more and more perfect. That's where Six Sigma and its rules may make sense, because it's highly principle driven. It's highly like you really always follow this dogma. You never leave it. The good is it's project independent. If you are able to develop your processes in this way and you have a business process like this, you probably can apply it to similar projects. I say similar because games are kind of like unique in itself. It is also a method that works very well with any of the other methods. We can basically put Six Sigma on all of the other methods to get them better and get our version of those methods better and better and better by just iterating those methods into the Six Sigma cycle. As I said, like it's a very broad approach, but what are the cons? It's a business approach. It's not a project management approach. So it will leave a lot of questions open. It requires a lot of training. Your people need to be trained. You need to be trained. You need to exactly know how those principles work and how you can apply them. And training can be expensive because if you have to train your entire team, and especially if you have a new hire and you need to first train them through your entire process before they can become productive, you may have an issue. So like quickly, so one of the last methods here, which is the rapid application development methodology based on rapid iteration. So we want to iterate very quickly. We want to build prototypes and refine those prototypes over and over and over again. Here, instead of planning, we plan on feedback. So we basically show our customers or ourselves as the players our product, and then iterate and iterate and iterate and hopefully achieve the end goal at some point. So it is kind of like one of a method that is close to the Agile domain. It is based on software. Usually it's meant to be like you develop something, you show it to your stakeholders, the stakeholders get back and forth. So it's back and forth. It's very focused on the user. So what do you actually want? But for a game development, how many players can you ask at any stage of your development? Is this actually the game you want? Okay, I take it back and I make it better. Is this now the game that you want? Well, you can probably imagine where you end up. It is also has the idea of being very fast in your prototypes. So not to spend years and years before the next prototypes, but rather like in the terms of months or a few weeks before the next prototype is done, which is good in the sense that you have quick results, bad in the results that you probably don't have all the results that you need. And it is this user dependency. This is a problem insofar because you can't ask an endless amount of players. You cannot act as this endless amount of players because at some point you get tired of your game. You know the game so well that you think either it's good enough or it's so bad that you stop working on it. Unpredictable, again, we don't have a final goal other than at some point we want to have a great game with this specifics. So hard, big team, big mess. That's the big thing for the Agile methods. The bigger the team, the bigger the mess. But good if you can organize it. And that's also, again, complexity issues that are related to it. Due to like, how do I manage a big team in this very fast prototype-based scenario? And again, you need to set quality standards and goals. So now coming to the golden question, probably, how do I choose the right method for my project? Well, let me ask a question first. Do I have to choose one? No, you don't have to choose one method. I think that's where the key point comes in. You can combine those methods. And I think this is like something that a lot of people forget. Like maybe for one part of the team, picking the waterfall model is better. But maybe for another part of my team, the Agile model is better. So now the challenge is just like getting those two working together. And this is like where the next point comes in, like people, process, and structures. This is what a successful company and a successful development is about. If I don't have the people, well, then I can have the best processes and structures in the world, and it doesn't work. If I don't have a structure and a way of how to communicate within my structure, and can't communicate to my people who is responsible for what, well, then they run around and no one knows exactly whom to ask, and we lose a lot by not having an optimal communication. And processes, and that's where project management comes in, it's one of the processes. It's not the only process, it's one of them. But just think of it like, if I know how to mix concrete, and I have a steel structure standing, but no one bringing the concrete to the steel structure, then I cannot build the building. So I need to really focus on having all those elements together. And that's where culture comes into play. That's where it comes to play that I need to know my team. I need to understand like who can do what and who works best where. And also, what do I want to achieve with this method? What are my goals that I want to do here? So the right method is actually what works with your team and your structure. As I said, like maybe you want to have like the feature team that works on your new cool feature working in an agile way because you want to have fast iterations. You want to be a bit unpredictable. So you are assuming the risk of being unpredictable, but you also you're also okay that this is more expensive because this is your key feature, that's your key selling point. But then on the other hand, some content production where you already know, okay, I know exactly how my content is to be done. You don't want to go agile. Why? In this way, you can say like, okay, I want to have my 10 levels. I want to have them done. I know one level takes me 2 months to make. Do those 10 levels with 2 people. So I'm basically looking roughly in a 10 months period of time. Why should I be agile about those levels? Again, depends on your game. Here comes your game into play and your project. I'm not saying that all levels should be done in Waterfall, because maybe there's some games that do want to be agile on their level design. Just make this decision consciously. Understand the methods. Iterate over your methods. Don't think that you can go into the store, pick a book, read about a method, and then forget about it for all the future. You need to constantly evolve your methods, your processes, your approach. So none of those off-the-book approaches will work 100%. You need to iterate on them, because just like in biology and in real life, stagnation is dead. So you need to constantly evolve. You get new people in your team, you need to think how those people will work with you. And don't be afraid to make a mistake. It's okay to make mistakes, but plan how you can adjust and fix them if they occur. Be prepared to fix a mistake. Or in the other way, if you fall, plan how to get back up on your feet. But don't be afraid to fall. Because if you be afraid of falling, well, then you probably never start walking. And then you never end up anywhere. So what did we talk about today? We talked about 8 different approaches to project management out of those 9,000. And I saw here in the site in the chat, there's a lot of cool other approaches that we didn't have time to cover. There are also all those mixed methods already. People like saying like, okay, I can mix this and this and this, and that fits perfectly for me. That's great. That's exactly what this was about. Talking about the advantages, disadvantages of the methods by itself, so that we can make educated choices of them. The important thing is be aware of what you get into your team when you pick a method or a set of methods, so that you can prepare for the disadvantages and make maximum use of their advantages. So where do we go from here? That's why I always like my famous last question here is like, first, before you pick your method, go and talk and see in your team. What is your culture? What are the dynamics? Who is talking with whom? Who can be more productive in which approach? Because maybe as the silent joker in your team works perfectly fine if you just give him a task and say like, hey, I need this back by the end of the week. I don't even want you in any stand-up because you won't be feeling comfortable talking. And then on the other hand, you have the talker that you need a little bit more like, hey, can we just keep track of your work? So really look at your team, understand your team. Then pick your method or your set of method and adapt. Try to evolve. See what works, what doesn't work. Ask yourself, like, what can we do better? And always keep in mind, there's always a benefit and a disadvantage of any method. There is no perfect method. That's what I also like to see and to show here with this session. Don't try to find the perfect method. The only perfect method that there is the one for your team that works perfect in this moment of time for your team. But there's not the perfect method that for one studio works in another studio. And don't be afraid to make mistakes. Just get things done, prepare for what can be wrong, and you don't need to prepare your entire team. You as the producer need to be prepared and the ones that lead with you. But don't do anything just because it could be wrong. You always, in game development is an atmosphere of uncertainty. So all you can do is reducing this uncertainty. And that's what it is about. And prepare. And yes, keep designing and developing. That's no matter if you're 20 years in the industry, if you're 10 years in the industry, or if you're just starting out, just keep working on your game development. Don't be afraid. Stop. And yes, things will go wrong, but for everything that goes wrong, there will also be something that goes right. And then live off those moments that go right. Well, that's the end for now. So yeah, feel free to stay in touch, asking questions. So I think we actually made it to have time for questions, which is
you did great. I always like to say, much like the business side of the industry, when people ask, it's like, so what's the best publisher looking contract? It's like, it depends. And the very same thing is true with that production style for your studio. There's not a given one. it just depends on your studio and your culture and all that kind of good stuff. So we've got first question, and if anyone out there, if you have questions, drop them in chat, and Tobias will be answering them shortly. So first one, what tips do you have for building QA into Scrum?
Onboard them early. So QA in Scrum, if you use Scrum, QA becomes basically an essential part of your development team. So just think like of a QA member similar to any other developer. So they should be integrated in your daily stand-ups. They should listen to what is getting done. And then what I recommend for this case, or what I did in the past when I used heavily on the Scrum methodology, and had a QA, I basically told my developers, define your stories clearly, because your story, when you say like, I as a player want to do whatever in my game, then this is what a QA member can understand, because basically he takes the card, okay, now I am this player and I want to achieve this, so I can test this feature. Let your QA know, okay, this feature, this story is done. And this is what the story should done. So basically for QA and Scrum, it's very important that you find what they should expect, keep them up to date in your process, include them, and include them early.
So what is the most common mistake that you see new producers making out of the gate?
Most common approach or common mistake. Probably not expecting problems. So I think like trying to think that being over optimistic that any, like basically I see two topic problems. Either the optimistic producer who thinks everything goes according to plan and then realizes very shortly before the milestone arrives, no, it doesn't go everything to plan, or the pessimistic approach, everything will go wrong, and then basically wasting a lot of development time. I think the thing is for a producer is finding the sweet spot between being pessimist and optimist. So like really this tension, like, yeah, I know potentially the worst case scenario will happen, but I'm not, while I'm planning with the worst case scenario, I'm not aiming to achieve the worst case scenario. I'm actually achieving the opposite. But I'm also not planning with the opposite.
Hope for the best and plan for the worst. That's the
exactly. And also one tip that I can give is like a lot of early project managers and producers tend to plan with the average week to have 5 work days. Do never plan with 5 work days. Plan with 4. Plan only with up to 80% of capacity, your team. This is like a rough guideline, because if you plan with 80%, you automatically account for vacation, sick leave, things that go wrong that you didn't foresee, without being suddenly in a situation, well, I already planned 100% of my time and now I need 120%. No, you already had this 20% in. And again, everyone in this industry, everyone in any industry is happy if you get to the results earlier. But you're more in problems if you don't get to those results.
That's actually really good advice that I had never even thought of, Tobias. But that's also why I got out of production a decade ago, because it started getting way over my head too. So from Court, what production method have you used the most or had the most success with?
Basically a mix. That's like why I had this kind of like this whole approach. Don't say that you have to stick to one method. Try to probably really analyze your team and mixing those approaches. So I usually had most success with mixing them, depending on different feature sets, and basically planning, okay, those things I can plan more ahead. Like this is what I mentioned before with the level planning. This is not really an accident, because if I do know how my levels work, I don't need to make them agile. I can put them as, and the same is like with your asset production. You don't need to make it agile if you exactly know what you want to achieve. But then I used also agile methods a lot when it comes to features that I do know, I don't know enough to define them. So I need to iterate. So for those, I like to tend the agile approach. So basically mixing those two approaches. And I had good experience like with a Scrum bun approach on the one hand for the agile side, and a more static approach when I had to work with outsourcing companies and asset production.
Are there any two approaches that you should not mix?
Well, probably if you want to mix critical path and waterfall, you probably don't get anywhere because you're basically mixing the same kinds of types with each other. So not really. I think they are pretty open that you can mix them with each other, but be aware of what kind of disadvantages you get. So usually your goal with the mixing of those approaches is you want to basically balance the disadvantages of one method with the advantages of another method. So if they both have the same advantages and the disadvantages, it probably won't get you anywhere.
So for producers who are working at publishing houses or even with larger developers who have multiple products, how many projects can a producer handle at one time?
Good question. That depends on your team size. I mean, my recommendation is consider to have a producer per 12, 15 people in your teams, roughly. That's a rough estimate. What I like to usually take as a picture here is like the Roman army, one of the most successful armies in the history, had this whole approach of breaking down in groups of around 8 to 12 people, their troops, and then multiplies of those. And that has a reason, because the normal human being can easily manage and oversee and keep in mind around 10 to 12 people, what they are doing. So I know this is something now for the indies. I can't afford 2 or 3 producers for my team. True. But that's where actually comes in, like, especially if you're more flexible in the indie developer, you can look into like some people who do bring some project management skills with them and double into roles. That's for the indie developers a tip. For publishers, obviously, you can work easily on more than one project as a publishing producer, because as a publishing producer, you are usually not in the day-to-day business of your projects. So yeah, it depends a bit on your structure and culture. So I personally had in the times where I worked on 7 projects at the same time, but I did have my producers under me working with me on those projects. So basically, I balanced this then by saying like, okay, I have my producer for this project, and this project, and they keep up with the day-to-day work, and I only have to jump in every other day or every 3 days to check up how they're doing.
So we got one last question, and then, for everybody here, if you have questions after the talk, you can chat with Tobias in our Discord. And if you missed part of it, if you go back into the Meet to Match session and click the link for this session, give YouTube a few minutes after we close this one out, and it'll be there for you to watch. And I had that question in my head, Tobias, and now it is not there anymore.
Seems like I'm lucky.
Yeah, you probably are, because it was a good one. Anyway, all right. Well, I cannot remember what that question was. So we've got a few minutes before Toya is going to come on and do her talk. So in the meantime, feel free, check out the Indie Showcase. Go to the Career Center. Our career production I do know what it was.
Go ahead.
Have you
still have time?
Yeah. Well, welcome to the show and my ADHD. For students who aren't coming straight out of university where they have a degree and training in production, are there specific pathways to being a producer, through other roles in the industry that you have seen that work better than others?
Yes and no. Normally, what I do see is like working your way through QA can work. It's like a very very traditional way. I know that the industry usually gave the tip, hey, if you don't find any other jobs, just start as QA and just make your step into the industry anyway. I know a lot of QA people who would hate me now, because they say like, you sent us all those people who don't actually want to be QA. They just want to be here to go away. So QA people are becoming very sensitive to it. But yes, working in QA is a good way, because you get an idea of like how the parts come together. Another area that works well is if you're a bit more on the technical side, on the engineering side, programming, simple programming and being clear, because there is also what I started increasing more and more using is like having a producer specialized on managing programmers and working with their schedule. So that's where you can actually, if you have a favor for agile methodologies, that's probably the better place for you to be via the engineering route. But be aware of that also for programmers, there are high entry level requirements usually. So because lots of studios, especially smaller ones, don't have the time to train you to be a good programmer. So you need to start being already a decent programmer. A very good scenario for you is, and that's also often forgotten, is you can make your own indie team. You can make mods for existing games or something in between. The good thing is that what we saw in the recent years, like now there are several 3D engines out there that are basically free for you to grab. Start planning your own game and show it that you can actually plan something and that you can achieve your plan. Again, if you are applying for a producer job and you can show me, okay, I planned this game, I executed this plan, this is how long it took me to do this, no one will look at your graphics because you're not applying for an artist position. You're applying for something else. So make clear what you apply for. And artists, by the way, or the art route is probably the hardest route to make a switch over to production. Yes, there are art producers, but most people in the industry think like, okay, artists are the one that are opposing production. So it's very hard.
Designers are the ones that are against production. They're the ones that keep adding stuff to the game. You know,
they keep adding, but most artists, by their nature, hate to be managed with their tasks. So that's what they have as a reputation. So you can make it as an art producer, but then probably it's better like straightway going a production route and not trying to be a good artist and then trying to convince everyone that you're also a good planner.
But I appreciate it, Tobias. That's the those are always some of the things that's what I did. I started out as testing and now I'm in business. And a lot of the producers that I saw come through the companies that I worked at, they started in testing as well. So but thank you very much, everybody. Go to the Discord. It's discord.gg/indiegamebusiness. We've got the career lounge going on there. You've got questions that you can ask not only Tobias, but the other speakers at the conference and the other speakers on the other folks on the server as well. And we will be right back with Toya. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.